Good morning, friends. Today we're going to listen to the story of the Nightingale by Hans Christian Andersen. Once upon a time, there was an emperor in China who lived in a vast and magnificent palace. The palace itself was filled with treasures, and the gardens all around it were a wonder. And beyond the gardens, there were many little fishing villages and farms and woodlands down to the sea. And people came from all over to visit the impressive palace and to stroll through the grand gardens. The emperor and his court never left beyond the palace gates, but many of the visitors would stroll through the paths and down to the ocean. And many who did this were rewarded by the most beautiful music they had ever heard, the song of the Nightingale. The nightingale was a plain little brown bird, and she would unassumingly perch on her favorite tree near the path of the woods. But when she opened her beak to sing, anyone who was nearby would stop what they were doing to listen, and they would wish for her to never stop singing. Now, of course, most of the people who came to visit the emperor's court were very important, and many of them were learned scholars who wrote books about their travels. And if any of these people were to hear the song of the nightingale, they were sure to write it in their book of all the splendors of the emperor's court, his palace and gardens, but nothing could compare with the wondrous song of the nightingale. And one day, the emperor of China received a gift from his friend, the Emperor of Japan. It was a book one of his scholars had written about the most magnificent wonders in China. And the Chinese emperor was delighted with the book, and he read it straight through. But when he read in the book, of all the wonders of China, nothing compares with the beauty of the song of the nightingale, who sings each night in the emperor's woods. The emperor gasped in shock. But since he had never left the palace gates, he had never even heard of this nightingale. How could the most beautiful thing in all of China be so close to his palace, yet outside of his gates? And so the emperor called at once for his minister. The minister had never heard of this nightingale, and the emperor insisted that he find the little bird at once and bring her to sing for his court that very night. And so the minister ran off and ran up and down the corridors of the palace, asking everyone in the court if they had heard of this nightingale. But nobody had. No one knew a thing about it. So he returned to the emperor and told him so. But the emperor said, "But this book is from my good friend the Emperor of Japan. What is written in it must be true. I insist that the nightingale be brought to sing to me this very night." And so off the minister ran once more. And this time he asked servants, he asked gardeners, he asked maids, and finally he came upon the lowliest little kitchen maid. This kitchen maid would often take leftovers from the kitchen and bring them to her grandmother. Her grandmother lived in one of the little fishing villages, and she would often walk through the woodland paths, and quite often she had been delighted many times with the song of the nightingale. The minister was cheered by the news, and he rushed to tell the emperor the good news, but instead he thought, "Let's go find the nightingale together," he told the maid. And so off they went. And they went past the palace gates, past the gardens, and into the woods. And a little bit behind them, other members of the court staggered behind, for they were sure they did not want to miss such an adventure. And when they walked for a little while off in the distance, they heard a sound like this. Moo. And the minister said, "So that is the sound of the bird." And the little kitchen maid laughed, and she said, "No, that is simply the mooing of a cow." And so they walked a little bit further, and they came across a pond, and they heard a ribbit, 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 ribbit. And the minister said, "Oh, so that must be the song of the bird. And the kitchen maid laughed again, and she said, "No, that is just the sound of a common frog." And at last they had reached the nightingale's favorite tree. And the girl pointed up in the tree, and everyone saw a small little bird sitting there. And the minister said, "Surely that little bird is not the thing that makes such beautiful music. It is quite dull and ordinary." But then the bird began to sing. And everyone stopped to listen, and they all felt it was the most beautiful music that they had ever heard. And when the nightingale had finished her sweet song, they asked for another and then another. And finally the minister called up to her, little bird, the emperor would like for you to come and sing for him at his court this very night. Will you please come back to the palace?" And the nightingale replied, yes, she would be honored to sing for the emperor. And they all walked back up to the palace. And the nightingale perched herself on the little maid's shoulder. And that very night, the emperor heard the most delightful music he had ever heard. He was captivated by the nightingale and delighted by her song. And when the evening was over, he did not want the bird to go away back to the forest, and he ordered that she should live in the palace in a golden cage. And the bird would sing for him every night, and twice a day she would be let out to fly to the palace gardens, but she would be held on by 7 servants who held on to 7 golden ribbons to keep her in the palace. And so this went on for many, many weeks, and the little kitchen maid was given many gifts and lighter work, and she was made head kitchen maid. And so this went on for many, many weeks, and the nightingale would sing her song and living at the palace, and everyone who lived there was enchanted by her. But then another gift arrived from the Emperor of Japan. This was a clockwork bird. It was many colors, and it was made of shining metals and precious sparkling jewels, and when you turned the handle, the bird would sing a wonderful song. The bird sang the same song over and over, but it was a delightful song. And the members of the court made the bird sing over and over. And then the emperor said, "Well, enough of this new gift. Let's hear a song from our nightingale." And when they all looked at the nightingale, she wasn't there. She had taken her chance to escape while they were distracted by the clockwork bird, and she flew out of the palace and flew back to her home in the woods, for she had missed her friends and her family, and she had missed the freedom that she had in the woods. And the emperor was disappointed, but everyone cheered him up, and they said, "The clockwork bird is much more beautiful than that plain little nightingale, and this one will never tire or need rest, and the song is just as wonderful." And so the court enjoyed their clockwork bird for many more weeks, and everyone learned to sing the wonderful song. But a thing made of metal and gears and springs will not last forever, you know. And one evening, the minister wound up the clockwork bird, and all they heard was a bing instead of a song. And the emperor called for his clockwork maker to come. And the clockwork maker did what he could to fix the springs and all of the gears that had popped on this bird. And the clockwork maker was able to make some repairs, but he warned them all, "This bird will not last forever. You must be sure to take care and not use it too often." And so the emperor kept the clockwork bird by his bedside, and only wound it up sparingly. And 5 years later, the emperor took gravely ill. He took to his bed and prepared to die. One afternoon, he was so close to death that the servants thought that he was about to die, and they went off to meet the new emperor. In fact, the emperor was still alive, but just barely, and death sat heavy on his chest. And he was haunted, and the emperor was haunted by the memories of all the good deeds he had done and all of the bad ones. And death reached over to take the emperor with him. And the emperor cried out with his last little bit of strength, "Leave me be!" And suddenly, the emperor heard the most beautiful music. It was the nightingale. And the nightingale had heard of the emperor's illness, and she remembered just how delighted he had been with her song, and she wanted to come and sing for him once more. And she perched on his windowsill, and after all the court and servants had left, she sang for him. And as she sang, even death became enthralled with the music. And when the nightingale stopped singing, Death implored, "Please, please, just one more song." And she agreed, but only if Death would leave when the song was over. And he agreed. And when the nightingale had sung her song, Death departed, leaving the emperor behind. And the emperor opened his eyes, and there were tears streaming down his cheeks. little bird, you have come back to me. Please tell me you will stay and always sing for me." And the little bird replied, "I am honored by your tears, and I am happy to sing for you, but my home is in the forest. I will come and sing for you, but you must tell no one, and you must allow me to be free." And the emperor agreed, and when she was quite sure that he was resting peacefully and gaining his rest, she flew back to her tree. And the next day, the servants came back, and they thought for sure that the emperor would be dead. And imagine their great surprise when the emperor was up and moving and dressed, and he joyfully boomed to his servants, "Good morning." The end. Thanks so much for listening to our story this week, friends. This week, if you want to make peg dolls and tell the story yourself, you can do that. And you can make the emperor, the minister, and the little kitchen maid. And also, if you want to make the birds, if you want to make a fancy, shiny clockwork bird and a tiny little brown nightingale, I used pipe cleaner and coiled it, and you can put it maybe on a pencil and you can tell the story like that. Thank you so much for listening, guys.